Okay, in this question we've been given some information to help identify these 5 bottles of water here, one of which is water. We've got 2 alcohols, an alkane and a ketone. Now we're given some information on the 5, which is to how long they take to evaporate. And obviously evaporation, just like boiling point or melting point, relates to the strength of the intermolecular bonds. So when you are giving your answer in scholarship, it's important to be complete. So you talk about the relevance of that, and that boiling point indicates strength of bonds, etc., and the energy it takes to change. So, and then we're looking at solubility, which is polar, non-polar. Now you may think to yourself, how do I know if glucose is polar? Well, glucose is sugar, and sugar of course dissolves in water, so just your common everyday knowledge, which should be enough to help you on that one. So immediately when we look at this, just to start off with, there's one that stands out straight away. It has a very long time to evaporate, which means it's got by far the strongest bond. And if we look in here to see which one matches with that and dissolves the most sugar, obviously we'd think that the ketone and the alcohols and hexane, they're not going to dissolve as much sugar as water will. And water, with its ability to hydrogen bond to itself, is going to have fairly strong bonds, which are going to take a lot of energy to break. So that's probably the easiest one to get. So you know straight away that water is B, and that information may help you get the others. So let's look at the other information and see if we can work that out. Now, if we consider this in looking at perhaps another easy one to identify, because propanone, for instance, has 3 carbons, and it's going to have a fairly small chain. This is going to create quite a high it's a fairly electronegative atom, oxygen, so we're going to get a dipole here. Now, because it's a relatively small chain, we'd expect that to be soluble in water. Propanol would expect to have some solubility, and as well as methanol. Hexane would expect to be insoluble. So when we look at this information and it says B and D were not miscible, that really is D dissolved almost no glucose. We're talking about something that's really absolutely non-polar. So that would be hexane. So hexane equals D. And that's also backed up by the fact that, you know, the time for it to actually evaporate is fairly low. So, you know, the only interactions that we've got between the molecules are, you know, temporary dipole ones, and so for it to evaporate, we'd expect a fairly low time. Now, that leaves us with A, C and E, and obviously we've got methanol, propan, 2-ol, and propanone left to identify. And when we look at these molecules, which would we expect to have the weakest kind of bonding, the weakest kind of intermolecular bonding? These, both methanol and propanol, have the ability to hydrogen bond. Propanone doesn't have the ability to hydrogen bond with itself, so we'd expect that to have a lower boiling point, so we'd expect that to have the shortest time to evaporate, so that would be E. So we've got E there, and as well as the fact that when we look at this information, it does have some miscibility with water, it would mix somewhat, and it's also would expect it to dissolve less than methanol and 2-propanol or propanol. So we've found propanone, and that leaves us really to differentiate between propanol and methanol. Now if we consider A and C, methanol and propanol, we've got a primary alcohol and a secondary alcohol, but that's really not that significant. We're told fairly similar information here, that they dissolve a small amount of glucose. So we've just got to really decide which is going to have the strongest ability to bond, which is going to take more energy, which is going to have the strongest intermolecular bonding. Now the fact that propanol is a bigger molecule, you'd expect the temporary dipole bonding to be significant, more significant than it would be for methanol, so you'd expect it to have stronger bonding. So that's really the thing that should lead you to decide that A is going to be propanol, and that really leaves C for methanol. Now, in explaining this through, I've gone through the process of the thought process, but you really need to explain this in a bit more detail. So when you're talking about hexane, for instance, you talk about the fact that it's miscible with water and doesn't dissolve glucose, that it's a non-polar molecule, and that bonding gives you the length of time it takes to evaporate gives you an idea of the strength of the bond, and that hexane, because it only has temporary dipole bonding, but it's a large molecule compared to the others at least, you would expect it to have you wouldn't expect it to have a very high boiling point. So the boiling point of the time of 30 seconds is in line with that. And you'd do a similar thing going through all of them. Water, its ability to hydrogen bond, making it a very strong intermolecular bond, taking a lot of energy, and therefore taking the longest to actually evaporate. The fact that it is a polar molecule, obviously, it's very polar, and the fact that it dissolves a large amount of glucose. They all are indications of water. And then when we look at figuring out propanone, that it would have the weakest bonding out of those three, and therefore you'd expect it to have a lower time reflecting the weaker intermolecular bonding, and you should discuss that kind of intermolecular bonding that it does have. It does have temporary dipole bonding, it does have a slight permanent dipole there, but that's significantly weaker than the hydrogen bonding that both propanol and methanol can do. And then in talking about methanol and propanol, the only real difference between those two, although you should mention their ability to dissolve glucose, because they do have that ability to be, they are polar molecules, so they will dissolve glucose, which is polar to some degree, and their time to evaporation, that they both have the ability to hydrogen bond, but propanol being a larger molecule, larger electron cloud, bigger dispersion forces, therefore it takes more energy to break those bonds, therefore it's going to take a longer time to evaporate. So try and be complete with your answers, and that's that answer.